We're going to continue our analysis, in this case of the Shita of the Rashba in Masechta Shabbos on Daf Chav Gimel and Beis regarding the question of Yayin. And what I find in my learning and my research is that the issue of Yayin L'Kiddush is very profound. Now, the problem with the Rashba in Chidushim is that he seems, at the face of it, to contradict what he writes in the Tshuvas. So in the Tshuvas, he was asked about the importance of Yayin in Kiddush, and his response was that on a Doraisa level, the Torah doesn't require Yayin, but rather the Torah requires Amiras Divrei Shvach. But in his Chidushim in Masechta Shabbos, he writes that in a case where he doesn't have money for the mitzvah of Chanukah, and at the same time the mitzvah of Yayin L'Kiddush, then for sure he has to purchase Yayin L'Kiddush because that's Doraisa. So the question is, do we want to assume A, that the Rashba changed his mind? I don't know which came first, the Tshuva or the Chidushim, but he rescinded his original position that Yayin was only rabbinic, was only D'Rabbanan, and now he's maintaining that Yayin is Doraisa. Or, alternatively, is there some possibility of reconciling the two statements of the Rashba? That on the one hand, he could say that the Torah does not require Yayin, but on the other hand, the Torah does require Yayin, which sounds like it's impossible to reconcile those two. Now, we'll see in a few minutes that even the Rashba in Chidushim, according to one approach, which is the approach of the Pri Megadim, did not really mean what he said. And we shouldn't take him literally that the Torah requires Yayin. But let's leave that for a few minutes down the line and focus on the following possibility in the Rashba. And again, this is one way of learning the Rashba in his Chidushim, namely that Yayin is a Torah requirement, but it's only lechatchila, what we call l'shleimus ha-mitzvah, for the perfection, the ideal mitzvah, but b'di'evet, if you don't have Yayin, or if you went ahead, you made Kiddush b'dvarim without Yayin, then you were Yotze, even on a Doraisa level. So in that sense, we're suggesting a middle-of-the-road compromise shita between the two extremes. One extreme says that Yayin is not recognized by the Torah at all, and Yayin might be some sort of a call it a Hidur mitzvah, but it's not a Torah law. And the other extreme is to say that, well, Yayin is an absolute requirement. And in the middle, you could say Yayin is D'Rabbanan. We're going to take the approach for just a minute or two that Yayin is D'Oraisa, but we're going to say that we're not sure if the Rashba would hold that it's Likuva, that it's absolutely critical, indispensable. So again, let's just review the three possible ways of going here from one extreme to the other. One extreme is to say that Yayin is not required by Torah law, and you certainly would assume that Yayin is only rabbinic, it's only D'Rabbanan. The other way of going is to say that Yayin is Doraisa and it's Likuva. It's absolutely critical. So we went from one extreme to the other. Not only is it not D'Rabbanan but Doraisa, but it's also Li'ikuva, it is critical. And the middle way of going, the middle approach would be to say, well, you're right. Yayin is only derabbanan. Now, we're going to make an attempt at accepting, so to speak, as two viable or valid ways of understanding the Rashba and Chidushim and Shabbos, and what should I say, two valid possibilities. One way is to say that the Rashba is on the other extreme in favor of Yayin, meaning upgrading Yayin to an absolute requirement according to Torah law. But then we cannot reconcile the Rashba in Chidushim with the Rashba in Chuvas, and we'll say that the Rashba changed his mind. Or alternatively, we can try to reconcile the two Rashbas by saying that the Rashba in his Chidushim only means to say that the that the Torah requires Yayin, but it's only, shall we say, an enhancement of the mitzvah of Kiddush, and the Torah itself is giving you a requirement to enhance the mitzvah of Kiddush, but it's not absolutely indispensable. It's not critical. And you may ask me, well, is there such a concept that the Torah requires something, but it's only lechatchila? It's only to embellish or to create an ideal mitzvah, but it's not likuva. And I'll tell you, yes, we have many, many such examples where the Torah will only require something lechatchila, but not b'diavad. Like, for example, the Gemara presents in the beginning of the second parak of Masechta Brachos the possibility that if you think the words of Kriyat Shema without expressing them, then you fulfill the mitzvah. But the Torah requires you ideally to be motzi b'sfasav, to express it out loud. But it's not likuv. Or, for example, we have the question of how many ksharim you need on your tzitzis. So it could be that the Torah requires 5, but b'diavad 1 is sufficient. With regard to chalitza, there are 2 parts to chalitza. Is one part where she removes the shoe from the Yavam's foot, and the other part is that she reads a parsha. Could be that the reading of the parsha is only lechatchila, and it's not likuva. In fact,
so another way of saying hidur, would you say?
Let me think about that. I don't know if it's exactly hidur. I'll tell you why I avoid let me say it this way. The reason I prefer not to use the word hidur is because hidur doesn't really affect the mitzvah itself or the chiyuv itself. It's a separate chiyuv, zeh keli v'aveil. What we're talking about now is a chiyuv that's inherent and part of the mitzvah, but it's not likuva. So you're right. I mean, in a certain sense, we're splitting hairs almost, because when the Torah requires something lechatchila, it means this is the ideal mitzvah. This is the best way to do the mitzvah. But we're not saying zeh keli v'amveyu. You buy a beautiful esrog, you could buy a more beautiful esrog or less beautiful esrog. That's zeh keli v'amveyu. We're talking about how to define a chiyuv, and we're saying that the Torah defines the chiyuv in a way that's lechatchila, but it's not likuva, and b'diavad you could do away with it. But that's part of the parameters and the extent of the chiyuv that the Torah imposed upon you. So the Torah could impose on one maisa A and B. Without A, it's nothing; it's worthless. But B is also a requirement. But if you did A, then the Torah would recognize that as a fulfillment of the mitzvah. So was suggesting that in the Rashba in Chidushim and Shabbos, what he's saying is that the Torah wants you and obligates you to make your Kiddush al yayin, but the Amiras Dvarim is sufficient to fulfill your mitzvah of Zochres Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho, but you didn't do it in the way that the Torah would have wanted you to do it. But you did fulfill your mitzvah. So when the Rashba and Tshuva said that the Torah requires only Amira, that's correct. But the Rashba and Tshuva was only talking about what is critical and what is indispensable. There he says that you could do away with Yayins. But what the Rashba is adding in his Chidushim is don't think that the Torah doesn't require Yayin. Torah does require Yayin, just that it's not Likuva and it's not absolutely critical. So until this point, we are definitely considering the Rashba in Chidushim to require Yayin min Torah. That's for sure. Whether or not we can reinterpret the Rashba and Shuvas so it reconciles, and the Rashba and Shuvas would also require Yayin min Torah, that we don't know. And it could be that, according to the Rashba and Shuvas, the entire entity of Yayin and Kiddush is only a rabbinic creation. It's possible. And then we cannot reconcile the two Rashbas. We have to assume the Rashba changes mind. There's another approach to the Rashba in Chidushim, which is very specific to the issue of adifus, meaning what should you buy if you only have limited funds and it's between Yayin L'Kiddush and Shemen L'Ner Chanukah, and that is that although Yayin L'Kiddush is derabanan, and in that sense, the Rashba and Chidushim would certainly be reconcilable with the Rashba and Shuvas, but nevertheless, it has a dint of a doraisa, which in Aramaic is called a lasa, lamed tov aleph. Lasa means that the Rabbanon are telling you something that impacts on a mitzvah doraisa. And what the Rashba and Chidushim means, and this, as I said at the outset, is the approach of the Pri Megadim. He wrote a sefer on Masechta Shabbos called the Rosh Yosef. And there he says that what the Rashba meant to say in his Chidushim is that the reason why Yayin would certainly trump Shemen L'Ner Chanukah, if he doesn't have Yayin, is because once the Rabbanon required Yayin for Kiddush, it has a Lasa D'Oraisa. That's what the Rosh Yosef says. And I think what he means to say, if I can translate his language into my terminology that I'm familiar with, there would be a Kiyum D'Oraisa. Now, can you say one thing and the other thing from the same mouth? That on the one hand it's a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, but on the other hand it's a kiyum d'oraisa? And the answer is absolutely yes. We have many, many such occasions where the Rabbanan required X, but through that X you fulfill a mitzvah d'oraisa. Like, for example, you could talk about tefillah. The requirement midrabbanan is to daven 3 times a day. But if someone were to come along and say to you, well, I davened, today we have 4 tefillahs, but I davened 1 tefillah in the morning, and then if I add another tefillah, that's only d'Rabbanan. That's not correct. I mean, it's partially correct, but it's a little misleading, because when I pray mincha, it's not that I'm doing something like Ner Chanukah or Megillah or Netilas Yadayim, and so forth and so on, which is pure Darabanan. What I'm doing is I am fulfilling the mitzvah of Havadatem es Hashem Elokeichem b'chol levavchem. Or, for example, Nicham Avelim or Hachnasas Kala, Bikur Cholim. These are all chiyuvim derabanan, but through those fulfillment of those chiyuvim, I achieve a kiyum doraisa of Yahavta l'recha kamocha. And according to Rosh Yosef, although the chiyuv of yayin and kiddush is only derabanan, by reciting my kiddush on yayin, I achieve a mitzvah doraisa. And once again, Joe is thinking, well, maybe that's called Hidur mitzvah. You might be right. But I think it's more than Hidur mitzvah because it impacts on the mitzvah itself. My Kiddush takes on a new dimension. So what I want to do now, and again, if you were my students in a class, I would ask you to write this down. I want to compile a list of nafkaminas. Again, we're not paskening, but what would the Rashba say if? And let's see how we can enrich that list. How many nafkaminas can we come up with? So the first nafkamina I want to suggest is they have a suffix. He Pasha doesn't remember if he made Kiddush al Yayin or he did not make Kiddush al Yayin. Shall we judge this as a suffix d'oraisa and then say suffix d'oraisa l'chumra? Or shall we say it's a suffix d'Rabbanan and we'll apply the principle of suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula? If you hold that when the Rashba in Chidushim says that Kiddush al Yayin is d'oraisa, it means you have a chiyuv d'oraisa to make Kiddush al Yayin, then in a case of suffix, you should require Kiddush al Yayin. You have to guarantee yourself that you've fulfilled the Torah law. And we might even go a step further and say that Kiddush al Yayin is li'ikuva. And therefore, if you have doubts whether you recited Kiddush al Yayin, you have doubts whether you fulfilled the mitzvah d'oraisa of Zochros Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. And again, we could touch, I don't want to go through the Tosfos Rid again about Halach L'Moshe Misinai and so forth and so on, but the Torah requires Yain.
But in other words, you're saying a case where he otherwise had recited some kind of a Kiddush Yain.
Right. He just doesn't remember if he had Yain at the time.
Right.
He may have been a guest in someone's house, and now he has reason to, he asked the guest, hey, can I have some wine to drink? The guest said, we have no wine. So now the host walks out, and he meant to ask him, well, wait a minute, did you make Kiddush al Yayin? Well, maybe he just had a little of amnesia, and he simply doesn't remember whether his Kiddush had wine in it. Now, if I take the approach of the split between the Tshuvas and the Chidushim, then in the Tshuvas, he holds that Yayin is not Doraisa. Or alternatively, if I take the approach of the Rosh Yosef, that what the Rashba meant in his Chidushim is that Kiddush is the Rabbanon, just that it has a Lasa Doraisa, then again, I would apply the principle of Safek the Rabbanon L'Kula. Now, by the way, I have in my ear, I'm hearing Rabbi Yeshua saying to me, Sabal, he used to use that a lot. You remember he would speak between Mincha and Ma'ariv.
Rabbi Weber, yeah.
Rabbi Weber. So somebody might say to me, well, even if it's a suffix d'oraisa, but we have a principle suffix brachos lahakel. But that's not right in this case, because if we're saying that Zochros Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho as a mitzvah d'oraisa requires yayin, then it's like the case where you don't remember if you recited Birkas HaMazon, and you would have to recite Birkas HaMazon. So that the principle of suffix d'oraisa l'chumra overrides the principle of suffix brachos lahakel. Now we have a second nafkamin. Listen to this nafkamin. The Noda Yehuda, who lived about 3 centuries ago, wrote a sefer called the Dagul Mirvava, which is a commentary on Shulchan Aruch. And he wants to know whether or not a man, a male, who already davened can recite Kiddush on behalf of his wife who hasn't davened. So you get the case. He already davened, she did not daven. Now the Magen Avraham, as you recall, says that if you davened and you recited the tefillah with Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadosh HaShabbos, then you already fulfilled your mitzvah d'oraisa. And the Noda Yehuda is afraid that in that scenario where he davened and she didn't, he cannot be motzi her, because his chiyuv is radically different than hers. He has fulfilled at least his mitzvah d'oraisa, and now he's only chayiv d'rabbanan. She, on the other hand, is chayiv d'oraisa, because if you remember the hekesh between kol sheyeshno b'shomer yeshno b'zocher, that she's obligated kiddush min Torah. And without going into the many, many intricacies of this premise here, that if he's only d'rabbanan, she's d'oraisa, he cannot be motzio, that requires a lot of study. But given his premise, then we have an issue. But if I presume that according to the Rashba, in Chidushim at least, as a separate shita from the Rashba in Chuvas, that Kiddush is d'oraisa and it is, Kiddush ala yayin is d'oraisa and it is critical, it's crucial, then so what if he davened? Obviously, when he was davening, he did not have a cup of wine in front of him, and therefore he has not fulfilled his mitzvah d'oraisa. Therefore, according to the Dagul Mirvava, he can come home, and without any inhibitions or hesitations, he could be motzi his wife in Kiddush, because they both share the same chiyuv. But if I assume, in order to reconcile the Rashba in Chidushim with the Rashba in Chuvas, and therefore let's take the Rosh Yosef, and the Rosh Yosef says that midoraisa, you don't need yayin, even according to the Rashba, and the entire institution of yayin is the Rabbanon, then we have the Noda Yehuda's problem. How could he be motzi her? He was already yotze min Torah. And now his chiyuv to make Kiddush al yayin is only the Rabbanon. However, if I go with that middle shita in my attempt to reconcile the Rashba in Shuvas with the Rashba in Chidushim, and postulate that the Torah does require yayin, but it's not li'ikuva, it only is l'chatchila in the ideal kiyum of Kiddush, then I'm not sure whether or not we can circumvent the problem of the Noda Yehuda. What are we going to say? Well, he was Yotze, but I'm not sure if he was Yotze, because he was only Yotze b'di'evet. He still has a chiyuv to make Kiddush al yayin, albeit as a lechatchila. So we might want to say, number one, that Sofek d'oraisa l'chumra here. I don't know. That's very unlikely, but we certainly could say that he shares a level of chiyuv d'oraisa together with his wife, even though he davened and she did not. Okay. Now, let me ask you the following question. A man davened in shul. He comes home, and his child, a katan, wants to recite Kiddush. Now, normally we say that a katan cannot be motzi a gadol, because the katan is only chayiv midrabanan, if at all, but as a mitzvah chinuch. Whereas the gadol is chayiv midoraisa, and a drabana cannot be motzi a doraisa. But once again, we come back to our issue. What does the Rashba mean when he says that yayin is doraisa? If he's saying literally that yayin is doraisa, and we accept the Rashba in Chidushim that yayin is doraisa, then he hasn't been yotze his mitzvah doraisa. Albeit, although he did daven in shul, but his mitzvah doraisa requires yayin. And in that case, the cotton could not be motzi him in Kiddush because he's still chayiv doraisa. But if I take the other approach to the Rashba, based on either the Chuvas or the reinterpretation of the Rashba Chidushim of the Pri Megadim, that Kiddush doraisa only requires Amiras Tvarim, then there's a wonderful situation over here, because when he comes home from shul to make Kiddush, he's only chayiv mirabana, and therefore Katan would share the same level of chiyuv as the gadol. They're both only chayiv drabanan, and he could be motzi. So that, I think, would be the third nafkamin. I thought maybe we could come up with a fourth nafkamin.
But it could be with regards to the katan that there are different levels of the rabbanans too. In other words,
Right, we have something called trade rabbanan. You follow what I mean?
no, what do you mean trade rabbanan here in
The
this
trade rabbanan
situation?
would mean that, let's say you have a mitzvah d'rabbanan and you have a katan. So you have trade d'rabbanan, meaning even if he were a gadol, it would only be a chiyuv d'rabbanan. And now that he's a katan, he has a chiyuv d'rabbanan. So in such a case, it could be he can't be motzi someone else who's a gadol in a mitzvah d'rabbanan because he's got trade d'rabbanan. So that's a gigantic machlokas, Rashi and Tosfos and so forth and so on. Okay, but what about the following possibility? What happens if a man made kiddush on a kos of yayin and then nishpach hakos, the cup of wine spilled? Does he have to start kiddush all over again? If I hold that kiddush is doraisa on yayin, then it could possibly be, I'm not sure about this, that in nishpach hakos, again, I'm avoiding another issue here whether he has to drink the wine or not. But I'm just going to assume for simplicity's sake, l'saber ta'ozen, as we say, that he would have to drink the kos. Like, for example, the Tosfos Rid says that Kiddush al yayin is halach l'moshe b'sinai, and therefore the Nazir drinks the wine of Kiddush. So the doraisa of yayin, that requirement as a doraisa requirement, requires not just to recite the Kiddush on a cup, but also to drink the cup, and now it was nishpach. So basically, If we say that yayin is likuva, which was one extreme approach based on the Rashba and Chidushov, then he's got to start Kiddush all over again. But if I say that yayin is only lechatchila, then it makes sense to say that if nishpach hakos, then b'di'eved we should establish that he's yotze without the kos yayin. See, but here I think we get into another issue, which you may remember we once discussed the Taz. Where he had two cups and he accidentally made Kiddush on the water instead of the yayin. So there we discussed the issue, which I'd like to rethink maybe for next time, of whether or not the Darabanan of Kiddush, if I grant you that Kiddush al Yain is Darabanan, would be a requirement even if he was already Yotze, his Chiv Shel Torah. Meaning, did the Rabbanan create a Chiv of Kiddush of al Yain as a separate independent mitzvah? But if, on the other hand, again, taking the Rashba and Chidushim straight, literally, kipshuto, that yayin is doraisa, and nishpach means, sorry, buddy, but you weren't makayim your mitzvah, you certainly have to recite Kiddush again. Joe?
I'm just trying to understand this with regards to, so what you're saying is with regards to the Nazir drinking the wine, that you're saying that it's not that he's Mekayim the mitzvah of Kiddush, well, as soon as he says it, so he shouldn't say it. It's that the wine itself has transformed itself from not wine to something that is mutter to him.
Right.
That's basically what you're trying to say. Is that it?
No, I'm just saying that if Kiddush al yayin is doraisa, the Torah requires you to drink the wine.
Well, according to Tosfot Rid, he says he has to drink the wine. So there shouldn't be a question, according to the Tosfot Rid, that definitely he would have to make Kiddush again.
Correct. But I'm just asking, according to the Rashba, we offered an alternative shot in the Rashba that Kiddush al yayin is only D'Rabbanan. And in that case, then the Rabbanan might say, well, you know what? We're going to require Kiddush al yayin when it could be attached and integrated into the Kiddush Doraisa. But if you already were Yotze the Kiddush Doraisa, the Rabbanan might hold back and say, well, you don't have to make a second Kiddush. The Rabbanan established Kiddush al Yayin to integrate that Yayin into the fabric of the Maisa Kiddush. But if Nishpach, and you've already completed the Maisa Kiddush, and this is going to be the Svar of the Taz, then the Rabbanan are not going to require a new Kiddush just to achieve Yayin.
But you can't spin that back to the Tosfot Rid as well and say that what he has done is made the yayin not yayin, but yayin of Kiddush, and therefore he drinks it, even if even though he's been mekayim his mitzvah of Kiddush by saying it over yayin. But the wine itself has lost its iser by being part of the bracha.
Maybe. I don't know. That doesn't sit well with me, but it's definitely something that we should look into.
Just as.
But again, I was only mentioning, I didn't want to get back to Tosas Rid because that will require another shir, another discussion. But I was only using the Tosas Rid to demonstrate that if yayin is doraisa, it probably requires shtia. It requires that you drink it for whatever reason. Otherwise, let the Nazir recite Kiddush al yayin and not drink the wine. But we're saying that if yayin is doraisa, then he'll drink the wine. Now I want to take a shot at a fifth nafkamina, number 5. I'm trying to jack up the numbers here. What comes first? Yayin lekiddush or ner lechanukah? If yayin lekiddush is doraisa, then lechora hands down. Forget about ner Chanukah if he only has enough money to buy yayin lekiddush and not buy ner Chanukah. That's what he has to do. But if, on the other hand, yayin lekiddush is only derabanan in the Rashba, which would seem to be the case according to the Tosfos, according to the Rashba and Shuvas, and according to, hands down, according to the Pri Megadim's understanding of the Rashba and Chidushim, then you've got one derabanan against another derabanan. And l'chari should flip a coin, and Rava doesn't know what, l'chatchila Rava was vacillating as to what he should do in that case. L'maskana, Rava says that the mitzvah derabanan of Ner Chanukah is greater than the mitzvah of Kiddush al Yayin. Why? Because of Pirsumei Nisa. So it's a special high-powered mitzvah derabanan, not like other mitzvahs derabanan, and it has the additional dimension of Pirsumei Nisa, that Maila, and therefore it overrides the mitzvah of Yayin L'Kiddush if Yayin L'Kiddush is derabanan. Now, if the Rashba holds that Yayin is only derabanan, and min Torah, as he says in the Tshuva, he could be yotzi with Amiras Dvarim, then it's quite possible that the Rabbanan would have been satisfied if he recites the Kiddush al Hayayin, but he might not necessarily require Shtiyas Hayayin. What do I mean to say? We have a minhag of giving out the wine to people at the table. But the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that the Makadish himself should drink the wine. And then, after he drinks what's called Mole Lugma, of a shir, a minimum shir, then he can give out the rest of the yayin to the Mesubin, to the people who are sitting at the table. Now, if yayin l'kiddush is doraisa, then the Torah requires yayin as part of the Maisa Kiddush. And therefore the Shtiyas HaYayin should be implemented by the Makadish himself, because otherwise we can't establish a Maisa Kiddush. But if Kiddush al Yayin, the requirement of Yayin is only D'Rabbanan, maybe the Rabbanan would say that somebody has to drink from the wine, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the Makadish. And if he can't drink from the wine, or whatever he didn't drink from the wine, as long as somebody drank from the wine, that would be enough to be Makayim the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of Kiddush al Yain.
Don't we have a concept of the kos itself? There's a problem with these things where you pour and it separates it into all these little cups, right? And they say there's an issue with that. So it's the kos itself that has that's a kos shel bracha. I mean, I don't know if that comes into play at all. Or...
Yeah, you're right. It could be that it's one thing if you have yayin before the Kiddush is recited and you're listening to my Kiddush, that might be sufficient because then my Kiddush is chal on your yayin. But if I'm going to pour it into another kos, then you might have a problem because that kos that I'm pouring it into is not a kos shel bracha. So this kind of thing, I don't know, is there a name for it? I know what you're referring to, where maybe there's a name for it in the shuk, that you
fountain,
pour.
right? A fountain cup or something like that.
What's it called?
fountain? Isn't it called the
Fountain. Okay,
fountain?
good. A fountain cup. So we'll call it a fountain cup. That might be a problem. So that's six nafkaminas. But I like the number seven. So let's see if we could get churn out a seventh nafkamina. The Chassam Sofer says that if you're davening in shul and you know that there's yayin on the table that you can make kiddush on when you come home, you should have kavana shelo lotzes, not to be yotze the mitzvah of kiddush during tefillah, because the Chassam Sofer wants you to integrate your kiddush dvarim, amiras dvarim, together with your yayin. So I want to suggest that maybe the Chassam Sofer would make sense if yayin is doraisa, because then you could say that the ideal Maisa Kiddush requires both A and B, amiras dvarim, and yayin. So the Chassam Sofer doesn't want you to separate that, because then the yayin is not connected to your amiras dvarim. You already yotze your amiras dvarim. Again, this is going to come back up over and over again, going to pop up in the Taz, but we don't know the Taz yet, let's say. We only know the Chassam Sofer. So let me suggest the following. If Kiddush is the Rabbanon, so I'm sorry, I make that mistake over and over. If Kiddush al Yayin is the Rabbanon, then when the Rabbanon required Yayin, you could say that they required it in addition to the Kiddush that you recited in Tefillah, and they want you to now fulfill their obligation as they established it to recite Kiddush al Yayin. So there's no need to press the Chassam Sofer's chumrah, if I could call it that, don't be yotze with Kiddush, have in mind not to be yotze with Kiddush. If, on the other hand, yayin is doraisa, then one could ostensibly argue that the Torah requires one entity. And in the Torah's vision, it's Kiddush Dvarim al Yayin, integrated into one whole. And therefore the Chassam Sofer says, well, wait a minute, you're in trouble if you were Yotze and Tefillah, because then you're splitting one whole into two segment parts. So that's, I think, the seven nafkaminas that I came up with. Let me just finish by offering a pshat for Yerushalayim. Nothing to do with Kiddush. The Medrash presents a dilemma, if I could use that term, for the Ribono Shel Olam, as to what name to give the city. Because on the one hand, Shem ben Noach, otherwise known as Malki Tzedek, gave the name Sholem. On the other hand, Avram Avinu, at the end of the Akedah, gave the name Yira. Yira. So the Medrash claims that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want to insult neither Shem ben Noach, Malki Tzedek, nor Avram Avinu. And he said, well, if I call the name Yira, Avram will be satisfied, but Shem will have taromas, he'll have a claim. If, on the other hand, I give the name Sholem, then Avram Avinu is a great tzad, he'll have taromas. So what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu decide? To be mechaber, to connect and integrate these two names, and make it Yira and Sholem, which becomes Yerushalayim. So the Anaf Yosef, in the commentary on the Medrash, says that each one, Malki Tzedek and Avram respectively, gave a name that would reflect what they thought was the ultimate, was the Ikar, the primary. Shem ben Noach said the Ikar is Shlemus. Shlemus Hamidos, Shlemus Hamalos. We should strive to do better and better in our interrelationships with our fellow Jews, with setting up a society that's based on midos tovos, that's based on morality, that's based on ethics, that's based on v'asisa v'yosher v'tov. But Avram Avinu had a different perspective. He felt that the ultimate is Yiras Hashem. And imagine how far he went with that, to be willing to give up his son on the Akedah for the sake of Yiras Hashem. So now we can sum it all up and say that at the end of the day, Yerushalayim is really an integration, not of Hamiras Dvarim and Yayin, but an integration of both Shlemus in Midos and Malos on the one hand, and Yira, fear of God, on the other hand. And we need both. I'm not sure which is more important. It seems that Avram Avinu got top billing here because it's Yira Sholem, not the other way around, even though chronologically Shem came first. But the reason why Shem's name came first of Sholem is because chronologically he experienced the Mabul, meaning he witnessed Ki Hishkis Kol Basar Es Darko Ala Oretz, Mi'ein Lo Nichtam Gzardinam El Gezel, and therefore he felt that for the continuation of God's creation, there had to be Shlemos in Midos and Malos. But it would seem that in the final psak of the Ribono Shel Olam, in his decision, Avram came first, Yira came first, which means that you cannot get to Yira without first Shlemos, but the ultimate goal after the Shlemos is to arrive at the pinnacle of Yira. Yiratzah may be his will, that would be Zochet to integrate in our lives, in the lives of Jewish society, these two elements of Shlemos Hamidos together with Yira, Kein Yiratzon, Amen. I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone
Amen.
not only a Chodesh Tov, but also I want to take this opportunity, because we won't see each other before the great day of the 6th of Sivan. We should all be Zochet to Simcha in our Kabbalas HaTorah on Chag